Hey craft nerds, how's it going? So I thought today I would show you some of the basic supplies that you would need to get started with seed beading, and in particular embroidery seed beading, and a couple of the stitches as well. For anyone who's ever been curious about how to get started with seed beading, I'll show you what I would start off with, with your initial kit. And just some of the really basic stitches that you can use, because honestly you can make so many things using just a handful of stitches that are actually quite simple. They're just very time consuming really. It is fiddly of course because the beads are so small, hence the name seed bead. But you know what, once you get started and you realize how many things you can actually create with seed beading, it's sort of like you catch the bug and you can't sort of stop doing it, really. At least that's what I found. So anyway, let's get into it. Okay guys, so one of the first things that I would get would be a bead mat. So a bead mat is just like a piece of velvet. It's got the same texture when you run your hand across it as a piece of velvet, and it basically just stops your beads from sliding all over the surface of your workspace. So whether that be a table top, or you would have seen probably my bead board, which is just something my husband put together for me with just a piece of thin masonite wood and a couple of strips of wood. And that's just been helpful to sit in front of the TV and have on my lap, because I can then put my bead mat on top of it and work on the table with it sitting on my lap. But yeah, this is just really handy. And if you don't have a bead mat, you could just use a piece of velvet if you have that, or even just a piece of material would probably work okay. These aren't expensive though. I think generally under $5 for a pack of usually 2 or 3. So it doesn't break the bank, but it's a very good thing to have. The other thing I would suggest is a little triangle. Now the reason that you would get a triangle is to clean your beads up. So I'll give you a little example. So for example, I would pour some beads out onto my bead mat after I finished working with them. They might have become a bit messy too, like spread out across the mat, and this just helps you easily scrape them up. You can scrape them into your triangle and pour them into your tube. So even a very thin tube such as this, you can start pouring them back, and that's why it has the triangle shape, so that it's just really easy to clean up your beads. I do have some other shapes. I don't use these that often, to be honest. So I've got this little trowel shape. This one would be probably good for bigger beads perhaps, and putting them into one of those larger craft containers, because you don't need to be as accurate. Of course, it's not so helpful for a tube because you can't pour easily into your tube. So there's that shape. There's this shape as well. This isn't bad. This is just one piece of metal in a long shape, and you can see it has that point as well. So let's give that one a go. So you scoop it from the side, get it into the center and pour it out. I guess the difference with the triangle is that you could leave the beads in there, and because it's got all the sides are have a lip, they're not going to go anywhere, whereas this, beads could potentially fall out the front or back. So there's the added benefit of just putting some beads into a number of different triangles if you wanted to do that as well. But this one is pretty good for pouring as well, because of the pointed shape there. So that one's handy. Again, I don't use it as often as the triangle. So a triangle is a very good tool to have. Now, of course, scissors are important to have when you're doing seed beading. You know, you want to be able to cut the thread. If you are doing embroidery beadwork, which is what I mainly do, then you want a nice small pair of scissors, because once you've finished beading onto your backing, whatever you're using, you'll want to trim around it usually, and then, you know, put a nice backing on the back of that as well. So, and sometimes depending on what you're making, you might have intricate shapes, so to be able to cut nice and close to everything and easily, it's just easier to have a small but sharp pair of scissors. And I think generally they are referred to as embroidery scissors. I will just pick up any sort of small scissors. I've tried a whole variety of ones. This one's a pair of birch scissors that I've had for a while. They're not as sharp as they used to be, so, you know, once they start getting a little tough to cut, I tend to get a new pair of scissors, because it does become a little bit tricky for embroidery. You really do need them to be very, very sharp. These are fine for cutting other things, but they're not going to be as good anymore for really detailed work, because they're just not as sharp as they once were. So yeah, definitely you want a nice good pair of scissors. Now, the other thing that you need if you're doing embroidery work, or even off-loom seed beading and that sort of thing, you need some thread. So I have a range of different types of thread that I use. To be honest, mainly I would use the Nemo or Nymo. I've heard it said both ways. Tomato, tomato, you know. There's the Eslon as well. Very, very similar, to be honest. And then there's this one that I've tried, which is the KO thread. And this one is a stronger thread, I believe, a nylon thread made in Japan. I haven't played around with this thread as much as the Nemo, and I think that mainly because Nemo is just, it's easy to get hold of and in different colours. So sometimes I've had Nemo in this sort of bobbin without the white part here, and sometimes it comes like this. More often probably looks like this. It's like a paper bobbin. There's a variety of sizes. The sizes I use mainly are B and D, because they're the slightly thicker sizes, and usually you want to go as thick as you can use just for strength, but there are times where, you know, you're using very small beads, or you're having to go through a bead a lot, and for that purpose you might decide to use the 0 or 00, which is a much thinner Nemo than these ones. Now, there's all different colours. I would suggest when you're starting out, the main colours that you would focus on, firstly, obviously black and white for sure you would want to grab, and then probably some sort of you know, mid-tone colour, maybe a beigey colour, or a grey even, just something that could work with a number of different colours. So I mean, I find I can use this sort of sand beige sort of colour with a lot of different bead colours, and it doesn't stand out too much. It really does make a difference to match your thread as much as possible to the beads though, so so that it looks nicer, and when you look at a piece overall, I mean, if you were to use white beads, for example, with a black thread, then you might not think you'll see too much thread, but really you will in the end. When you have a look at it, it will make a difference. And I've learnt that the hard way, I guess, because I didn't have a lot of colours of thread and would often just pick whatever colour, and then really regretted it with some of my earlier pieces. But I was just learning, and I didn't have that much thread to use back then. So, you know, use what you can, but if you can, try and get a few colours at least of these. Like I got this Eslon tube, for example, from Over the Rainbow, and this had a variety of different colours in the one tube. I think this was maybe $20. Honestly, I forget the price of these tubes, but they last a really long time. Or, you know, $2 or $3 will get you a bobbin of Nemo thread, so they're not too expensive. It just depends how quickly you go through them, really. So you can see I've got a whole variety of different colours of the Nemo in there. Some other possible threads that you might use, I really like this one for a lot of strength. If I am making a few components, for example, and then at the end wanting to use something to put those components together, and maybe there's only a few joins between pieces, so you know, maybe, I don't know, if I'm joining something to something with one bead, so it really needs a lot of strength in that one join, because that is going to be the only section that's tying those two components together. You want something really strong, obviously, in that case, because that one point is really holding those two parts of a necklace together, so it needs to be really strong. I hope that's making sense. It's hard because I don't have components to kind of show you, but you know, if you made two circle components and they're joined by a single bead, for example, just because of the design, you want that thread in that single bead to be really strong. That's where I find this one has been very, very good. There's not a lot of colours though, so I think I've seen beige, maybe black, and do I have a black? I think I've seen it. Oh yeah, I've got a beige. I think there may be black as well, possibly. I'll have to have a look, but I've definitely used the white, and I've got this one, which is a finer strength, and this is a medium strength, and that's the thickness of it. So you might not be able to get away with medium if you're doing seed beading. That's where you might use the fine, but it is stronger than Nemo, so even in the fine. The other one that's very, very commonly used is Fireline. So Fireline is, again, it's stronger than your Nemo, less likely to be cut by crystals. So this one is most commonly used anytime you are making something with Swarovski crystals, or any other crystals really. Then usually a pattern will call for Fireline because it will be less inclined to break. Now this is a braided thread. I think it actually back in the day was just mainly used for fishermen and making lures and things like that, and I think it still is, but it's very much used by beaders as well. So there's different colours as well. I have a smoke colour. There's different strengths, like thicknesses as well. This is a 6-pound smoke in 50 yards. This is a thinner one, so it's a 2-pound crystal, and again that's 50 yards. I don't think you'll see the difference if I hold it up though. There is a very small difference. I'm not sure if the camera is going to pick that up, but the thickness of them, it's minutely different, and again it would just be dependent on the beads that you're using or the design to what you can use. Use the thickest thread you can, in my opinion. because it gives as much strength as you can add. A couple other things that I have tried, which are this dandelion here, which is again quite a strong thread. The thing I didn't like as much about this one is the black is a bit patchy, and I think from memory it sort of wears off. So it must be sort of a black coating, and it's not even really black, it's more of a grey. So I don't tend to use this one as much, but that is an option. And you know, I recommend giving all of the threads a try, because each beader is different in what they prefer. And you know, you can put a whole group of beaders together in a room, and each of them might have something completely different that they use as their main thread. Most beaders will use different threads at some point, but usually favor a thread. This is another one here, which is a monofilament. It's not going to be as strong as your Fireline, because that's a braided filament versus a monofilament. Mono meaning obviously there's just one thread. It is thicker, so there is that, but the braided's just generally going to be a bit stronger, because if something does happen to cut through one of the filaments in that braided thread, then there's still two other potential, or however many filaments there are in the braid, there's still potentially some strength to it, whereas a monofilament can, once it's you know, something cuts through it, it tends to break. So but this is really good if you want to have really clear thread. You know, if this one would probably be more for stringing actually than seed beading, and any part where you really just didn't want to see the thread too much, you wanted that clear, like illusion cord is what they call it, because there's like illusion necklaces where the beads almost look like they float around the neck, because the thread is so see-through that you really can't quite detect it's there. You can see it a little bit, but you can't too much. So anyway, that's some threads. Now, obviously, once you have thread with seed beading, it's generally all done with a needle. And there's all different needles that you can choose. So I'll just show you a few that I have on hand here. I am quite a fan of the Birch brand. This is mainly because it's easy to get. It's usually the one that's sold at like Spotlight or Lincraft and places like that. They have a good variety of needles. So the size 15 needles are one that I like to have on hand always. And I like to have a lot of them on hand because these are very, very fine needles. So the higher the number, the smaller the needle. Similar to seed beads really, the higher the number, the smaller the bead. So these are really fine beading needles. Now I don't even know, I will try to show you what that looks like, but it is, as you can see, very fine, quite thin and a little difficult to see, but it's basically a really, really fine needle. And the beading needles, typically the head of the needle is very fine and in line with the rest of the needle, so that it can be pulled through a bead. So sometimes with, you know, a sewing needle, the head of the needle where you would thread the put the thread is bigger, because it can be, and that can be easier to thread, and it doesn't have to pull through a bead. Whereas a beading needle, that head is what often gets stuck in a bead, so you really don't want it to be big and bulky, and it can make it a little trickier to thread it. So that can be difficult. This is the finest needle that I use, is the size 15. There might, I'm not sure if there are finer ones. Possibly. I think you would really struggle with those not break, like trying to make them not break. Now another one that I like to use in various sizes is the sharps. So this is a size 8 sharp. So I mean, I'll show you the difference. The thickness is quite obvious when you sit them next to each other. Yeah, so it's difficult to get these to focus too well in the camera because of how small the needles are, obviously, but hopefully you can sort of see a bit of difference in the thickness there. The size 8 is a lot thicker than the size 15, and you can see that one needle is also shorter than the other, and that is because it's what we call a sharp. So the difference between a sharp needle and I'm not talking about how sharp the point is, but the type of needle called a sharp and the type of needle called a beading needle is the sharps are little stubby needles, and that is to give them added strength. So these are typically used for anything like stiff, thick materials, leather materials, anything that's difficult for a needle to penetrate without breaking. That's often what you will use a sharp for. Now, when I started doing seed beading, at that time I was not aware of ultra suede. In fact, when I very first started beading, which was something like 15 years ago or more, there wasn't a lot of supplies in Australia as far as embroidery beadwork goes, and most of the craft stores I approached had never heard of any of the materials I was asking for. So ultra suede wasn't something that you could get hold of from Australia very easily. So I had to sort of try and get things from the United States, but also I wasn't even aware of that material at the time, because I mean I was still investigating all of the materials myself, and so I used other things like vinyl. I did actually use some leather offcuts when I first started, because I had read that other beaders had used things like that. The reason being, you want something that doesn't fray. So if you're using leather or a faux leather, then generally speaking it's not going to fray. Faux leather obviously depends how they make it, but generally that won't fray. Ultra suede is the same, it won't fray. Now, and that's really important because, you know, you're trimming up quite detailed, you know, embroidery work. You don't want those edges to fray. So yeah, when I was using leather and even vinyl, a sharp was, you know, very key to being able to bead around the edge of your work when you were finished, because it had to penetrate the leather, the ultra suede, the leather, the stiff stuff, and anything else to be able to do the edging. So anyway, then there's other needles like beading needles that are sort of sizes, you know, 10 to 13. So generally speaking, when you're starting out, I think I would recommend mainly the beading sizes 10 to 13 and a mix pack. This did have a mixed assortment of needles in it. So you can get the birch ones. They have the mix packs. It sort of looks like this, but this is a different brand, and I've lost the packaging, so it might be Pony brand, this one, I can't remember. These are a good size because for most beadwork you do, you can get away with anywhere from a 10 to a 13 size needle, and then it's when you get when you're doing something with a lot more thread going through it, particularly probably things like beaded chains, you know, right angle weave often depends on the pattern really. Anything that ends up being a lot of thread through the same bead, and then you start wanting a thinner needle, and you know, again, if you're using size 15 beads, you'll need a thinner needle. So I would suggest starting with a packet of your 10 to 13 needles is key. Possibly get yourself a packet of the size 15s. You'll know pretty soon if you'll need that. And then depending on how you do your edge work, you might also want a packet of the sharps. I still use the sharps even though I use ultra suede, because I do still find that it goes through easier around the edge. So that's an option for you if you find that easier. Now, some other things that you can use that are possibly optional, depends on how, you know, depends on yourself. You know, some people will say, oh no, I need to use those things, and others will say, no, I don't really. You could use a needle threader. Now, bear in mind this may not go through a size 15 beading needle very well. I actually haven't tried that for a while, so I can't remember if it goes through. You will probably be okay with the other needles. The larger the needle, the easier this will go through. But you know, look, it can help a little bit if you struggle to get needles threaded. So there's that. And these are only cheap anyway, so the other thing that some people love to use is something to condition the thread. Now, you could use a beeswax. So the idea with this is that you would pull off your piece of thread, you would basically hold the thread here and then with one finger pull it through your thumb, like, you know, pull it out and pull it all the way through so that it's against that wax, and then by pulling it through it gets coated all the way along the thread in the wax. Now this is to help with conditioning, so it's meant to help stop it getting, help stop it fraying, helps it not to get caught and knotted and things like that, like meant to reduce tangling and knotting. I don't really like this for embroidery work because you will sometimes get clumps of wax that gets that builds up when you pull your thread through your material or your stiff stuff, that the wax can accumulate in spots. It's not so great for that. But if you're doing beadwork that it's not embroidery beadwork, then you could use this. Or give it a try with embroidery. You might find you like it. I just personally don't really use it. The other one's Thread Heaven, similar concept. I think this one's more of a latex. I could be wrong. Obviously if you're vegan, you're probably not going to go for beeswax. But I think this one is vegan friendly. I will double check that. That's optional. The other optional thing, but quite handy, is a bead case. So, you know, of course you'll probably want to get a pin cushion as well to put your needles into, but otherwise you might want to keep some in this. You know, especially if you are traveling with needles, it just stops them getting stuck and, you know, going through things or getting lost or whatever. And again, these are not expensive. Another optional thing, you might think this is a bit strange, but I usually have a pair of pliers with me when I'm doing seed beading work, and the reason is sometimes your bead gets stuck. Now, I would err on the side of caution with this next technique that I'm about to tell you, because I have broken beads by doing this. But you know, if your needle does get stuck, sometimes it just needs a good firm pull through with a pair of pliers. Now you do need to be slow and careful, and sometimes you're not going to be able to get the needle through if it's just too much thread through a bead. You know, pulling it through may break that bead, so just be careful. But I often, and you learn usually when you're pushing it and when you're absolutely fine to kind of yank a needle through something. And you will learn the hard way as well. But, you know, particularly when you're doing edge work, I find if there's a bit of E6000 in my way of my needle, it's a bit tough to pull it through. So I get this and I pull it through, you know, my edging. And, you know, other times it might just be I need to help ease it through a bead just that little bit, but you do need to be really gentle and careful, and sometimes you're not going to be able to do it. And if that's the case, pliers are good for getting you out of that situation too, and sort of pushing the needle back the other way when you realize that you can't go any further. Again, you could break the bead, so be careful. And the problem with breaking a bead with any sort of seed beading is that all of the thread in that spot is exposed, and it's pretty much impossible to fix it without unpicking it, unless you can somehow cover it with something. So just be very careful is all I'll say. But I do like to have these on hand. Now, I've talked about all these different things, and you know, of course you need beads. So you've got, like, this is a size 15 bead here. Hopefully you can see that. It's just a Ceylon Smoke Grey. I'll zoom that in a little. So we've got our Ceylon Smoke Grey there. I'll put next to it, this is a Ceylon, I think it's Grape or something. I forget the name of it, but it's a Ceylon size 11. So you can see hopefully a slight difference in the sizes there. The size you'll need most is generally size 11. That is the most used size for most patterns, most things. Size 15, in my mind at least, would be the next most used for seed beading, for me at least. But there's also a different shape. So these are your rounds, and they're called rounds because of exactly that. They're sort of rounded edges. And the different one is your more rectangle ones. And depending on the brand, they have different names. So I think this was a Toho. I sell mainly Toho. I do have some Miyuki. They're just both Japanese brands. The Miyuki are they call these Delicas, and the Toho call them Treasures. There's no difference. They just have a different name. I use them together in projects, and there's different colors. Someone did tell me there's different sizes, but I have compared some and didn't find that. Might be depending on the color, maybe, I'm not sure. Yeah, bulk of your patterns are going to have size 11, 15, 8 and 6 mainly. And you know, of course, some Delicas depending on what you're making. Delicas or Treasures are really good for any sort of stitch where it needs to be very uniform and it's quite a square shaped stitch, like square stitch actually, peyote stitch, brick stitch, anything where the blocks are sort of interlocking in some way. So brick is exactly like a brick wall. They, you know, and if you see bricks, they're the same size and they interlock with each other, if you like. Anything that's a bit more flowing, organic, any sort of beaded spirals generally, I find are better to use rounds. I find generally embroidery work better with rounds, just because, well, depending on how you do it though, but often rounds, because if you're doing any curves and stuff, these curve against each other much nicer. So it really depends on what look you're trying to achieve, but you will notice there will be quite a bit of difference if you do the same stitch with delicas versus rounds. They look quite different. Alright, so the other things that you'll want to use is, let's zoom out actually. The other things you'll want to use is a piece of beading foundation. So this is Lacey's Stiff Stuff. It's a very strange name, I know. I thought it was a joke when I first heard it, to be honest. Stiff Stuff sounds a bit rude. Let me see if I can show you. Alright, so Stiff Stuff. This one's from Fire Mountain Gems. This stuff is really mainly what I bead on. There are other things you can bead on, I've heard, but I honestly haven't branched out from the Stiff Stuff because it's really easy to obtain Stiff Stuff. I know it, I know how to dye it, I'm comfortable with it. By all means, if you want to try other things, you know, go and try everything. I've seen people bead directly on leather. I can't remember the name of it, but there is another sort of foundation thing like this that some people use, but most commonly you'll probably see Stiff Stuff, and yes, it can be dyed. Now it comes white generally. Some people will dye it for you. You can buy some pre-dyed stuff, and I did start by doing that instead of dyeing my own. Now I dye my own. It's so much easier because you can make as many as you want and whenever you want and whatever colour. I use the RIT dye. Let me show you that. So I just use these RIT dyes. You can get the powdered ones or the liquid. Both have been fine. They are really easy to use. So I just get a square, like rectangle, sorry, casserole dish with boiling water. Put this in it to the specifications. Dye it. And then make sure you agitate the Stiff Stuff to get any excess off it and that sort of thing, and you know, sort of rinse it and then dry it basically. The hot water helps it set, and yeah, and it's got salt in it, the mixed one, otherwise you can pre-mix them from the powders. Okay, well I was going to go and show you some stitches, but I think this video has gone long enough, and I think that's kind of a good place to start anyway, is to talk about some basic materials for seed beading. I thought I'd do some of this because, you know, some of you may not have done seed beading, might be interested in it, and, you know, might get something out of this. You know, I can definitely show some basic stitches and things like that. I didn't want my channel to be entirely beadwork, which is why I don't have, you know, a whole host of beadwork videos. I want my channel to be something to inspire creativity in life in general, but you know, obviously I do beadwork, and so I can kind of go into some depth with this and share that with you. Alright, my mouth hurts from talking, so I'm going to finish up here. Alright guys, so yeah, I'm going to finish it up there. Hopefully you enjoyed having a look at the different basic materials, some threads and things like that, and it's just a basic overview. There's going to be things that I didn't touch on, different needles that, you know, other people might use that I don't. You know, let me know in the comments, have you tried seed beading? Is there some basic materials that I didn't mention that you would use. Everyone's going to be different. These are kind of the basics that came to mind for me and what I would probably recommend. You know, let me know if you give it a try, and I'd love to see what you come up with. Alright, anyway, next time we will go into some more stitches, and you know, if you want me to elaborate on anything, I can do a video on like thread separately or something like that. And we'll see you next time. Make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss those videos, and yeah, I'll catch you next time. Bye guys.